Okay, hello. Ah, all right. There's three main topics I want to talk about today. I know last time I gave this lecture, I only got to the first one. It took up the whole lecture, but we'll see. Who knows? Maybe this time. Uh, right. So one of them, I mean, when you see what the first topic is, you'll see it's not really just one topic. It's like freedom, morality, personal identity. Um, so like these three things are totally connected to each other, but still, obviously, each one of them is really big, and that's why it might not get to the other things, even though the other things are important. Um, the second thing is these, mostly this one, but right, there's these other classifications or characteristics of ideas he talks about at the end of book two. I think adequate, inadequate is the most important one, if I get to it. Which of our ideas are adequate and why? I mean, also some of the things he says about clear and obscure ideas or distinct and diffused ideas are also interesting. And then finally, there's this topic, which is important enough that if I don't get to it this time, I'll have to talk about it at the beginning next time. Um, maybe I shouldn't say it. Maybe I shouldn't call it madness. Association of ideas. But then Locke says this is madness. This is both what causes what we usually call madness, like people who are more fit for bedlam than for civil conversation, right? Like they have to be institutionalized, but also that when it happens, like locally for, you know, people we usually think of as sane, that's a respect in which they're mad. And and then he says that's true of all of us basically. In some respect, we're insane. Um, but I mean, this is really important because um, in Hume, association of ideas is gonna like take on a huge role. And then in the British philosophy after Hume, association becomes like a central topic. Um, so like I said, I hopefully will get to all three of these. If I don't get to number two, I'll probably just will skip it. But if I don't get to number three, I'll talk about it next time. All right. So with no further ado, I'll start talking about freedom of the will. Um, so, um, so freedom or liberty, um, yeah, so freedom or liberty, and Locke appears to use these two terms interchangeably, right? It's just Latin, liberty is the Latin equivalent of freedom. Freedom or liberty, Locke defines as a power, right? So it's a power or faculty um, of the mind. And what power or faculty is it? It's the power um, to do or forbear doing, depending on the will. I guess maybe I should say, depending on preference. right? So I'm free, uh, I'm free to do something if whether I do it or not depends on whether I prefer to do it or not. And I've done something freely if I preferred doing it to not doing it. And if I had preferred not doing it, I would have not done it. Right. So, um, now, as a kind of side note, because so like this, I mean, this is a little ways back in the reading now, right? This is the chapter where he talks about power. Um, and he talks about how we get the idea of power. So again, this is going to be important when we get to Hume. So like Locke says, we get the idea of power by observing changes and inferring a power to bring them about. That's the very beginning of the power chapter. What chapter is that? 21. Book, the mind being everyday informed by the senses, the alteration of those simple ideas it observes in things without. Again, this is this loose way of speaking as if the ideas were in the things without, but actually the ideas are in the mind. What's in the things without is the qualities. But okay, the mind being every day informed by the senses of the alteration of those simple ideas it observes in things without, and taking notice how one comes to an end and ceases to be, and another begins to exist which was not before, et cetera, et cetera. It also comes by reflection. Um, considers in one thing the possibility of having any of its simple ideas changed, and in another the possibility of making that change, and so comes by the idea we call power. Right? So it's because we see things. So, I mean, the the looseness is actually hiding a problem here. It's because, so what do we see? Like we first we were perceiving one kind of idea and then we perceive another one. Right? Like, so we're receiving the idea of a solid snowball, and then we're perceiving the idea of like a puddle of water. Right? So, and we collect that something must have changed it. And that's how and so there we get the idea of the power to be melted and the idea of the power to melt. And that's how we get the simple idea of power. So, I mean, there's two problems with this. One is, as Hume will point out, um, this isn't a way we can get a new simple idea according to Locke, right? Like this sounds like the mind's making its own new simple idea because right, what I perceived was frozen snowball, puddle of water, and then I inferred a power, and that's how I got the simple idea of power. But we're not supposed to be able to get new simple ideas by inference. So that's a problem. But also, there's another problem, and this is something I kind of alluded to before when I talked about how we get the idea of power. Like, given what observing means, so I observe a change. What does that mean? Right? So here's like time one, and here's time two. And at time one, the snowball was solid, and at time two, it's become liquid. So, and here's my mind at time one, and my mind at time two. And my mind is perceiving different simple ideas at time two than it was at time one. Um, and to say that I perceived a change in the snowball means that I perceived that whereas the snowball at first had the power to cause me to perceive this idea, Now it has the power to cause me to proceed with side. So I had to already have the idea of power to quote unquote observe changes. Um, this observing changes in external things or in my own mind by reflection is observing changes in what powers they have. Okay, so like I don't want to try to resolve that, except that I think that, so what I said before, that the idea of power is a simple idea that comes with every idea, and it's like being and unity. Seems like what Locke should say, and that like addresses both of these issues, if that's really what he means. And then you have to explain why he seems to say something else here. And I'm not going to try to do that, but that, okay. So anyway, that's just like a footnote, just because this is, uh, the discussion of the freedom of the will is in the chapter on power. So, okay, so this is the will. So, sorry, this is freedom. So freedom is this power. Will is the power to refer, right? Like will is the power. So like if I'm free to pick up this pen, that means whether I pick it up or not. Well, it means that if I prefer to pick it up, I'll pick it up. And if I prefer not to pick it up, I won't pick it up. But will means I have the power to prefer to pick it up or not to pick it up. So like for short, you could say freedom is the power to do or forbear depending on the will, right? Like depending on what I will to do, that is what I prefer to do. I'll either do or forbear. Right, and it's important to Locke that you have the power both to do or forbear, not just one of them. Right, like he gives this example of being locked up in a room where I happen to want to be. Like I really want to be in this room. So I'm like there voluntarily, he says. Right, but I'm not there freely because I'm not free to leave. I'm only free to stay. So okay, so the result of this analysis, though, is that if you ask, is the will free? Is there freedom of the will? The answer is, well, that's a bad question because the will isn't a proper subject of the predicate free. Right? Like what has the power to do or forbear is a substance. Every power has a substance as its subject. Now, and like, remember, this is the part I was like alluding to when I said that although Locke says really bad things about the idea of substance, he seems to think that we really need it still. Right? It's just, but we have to be really careful about what we do with it because it's such a confused idea. Um, so, right, because yeah, we can't conceive of the quality subsisting on its own. It has to be in a subject, the subject that has this power. In this case, the subject that has this power is the mind. So the mind has a power to do or forbear. Now, if you ask, so the mind has a power to prefer or not to prefer. This is the will. But now if you ask, is the will free? You're asking, does the will have the power to do or forbear? That is, you're asking whether this power has a power. And Locke says that makes no sense at all. Powers don't have powers. Substances have powers. The mind has a power, right? So the mind can be free or not, but the will can't be free or not free. He says it's like asking whether the power to dance has the power to sing. Right? Like that question makes no sense. So that's his first answer to the question, is the will free? But right, he says, this is chapter 21, section 14 on page 225. He says, it is as insignificant to ask whether man's will be free as to ask whether his sleep be swift or his virtue square. Right? Like you ask, is he sleeping quickly or slowly? So there is something about that in a Dr. Seuss book, but all right, never mind. Right. So but is that so that answer, and that's the answer he gives first, and he puts a lot of stress on it because he says, like, and so we see that all this debate about is the will free or is the will not free is just like nonsense, like misuse of words or something like that. And if we just cleared up how we use the words, the whole debate would go away. But I mean, the truth is that, as Locke himself admits later on in the chapter, this is really just it's really kind of a nitpicky grammatical response to the question. Because, I mean, when we asked, is the will free, we didn't mean to ask, does this power have this power? That question doesn't make sense, right? But there was something we meant to ask. What did we mean to ask? So, because it's true, the will is a power, but like every power, the will has acts or operations. That is, operations of preferring something. And what we really wanted to ask is, are we free to operate in that way? And that makes perfect sense, right? That makes just as much sense as, am I free to walk, or am I free to, right? Am I free to prefer or not prefer? That is, can I do or forbear preferring depending on my preferences? Right. So Locke, starts talking about this question, which is the question we're trying to ask in section 23 on page 229. Willing or volition being an action, and freedom consistent in a power of acting or not acting. A man in respect of willing or the act of volition, when any action in his power is once proposed to his thoughts as presently be done, cannot be free, right? So there he's answering the real question. Willing or volition is an action, and freedom consists in the power of acting or not acting, depending on preferences. So now we have a question that does make sense. Is the will free? And meaning not, does this power of preferring have the power to do or forbear, but do I have the power to use this power or forbear using it in a certain situation. And um, Locke's answer is no, right? That was even in that sentence I just read from the beginning of section 23. So after having said, oh, this is just all confusion and whatever, this debate would be settled easily if people would use their words right. When he goes on to raise the question we were actually trying to ask, when we asked, is the will free? He says no. um, and there may be some strategy to that, right? Like if you're kind of easily put off, he would prefer you to go away thinking that the question doesn't make sense. But if you're up for a more serious argument, he's going to explain to you that no, the will isn't free. But he actually does that in two parts. So if this is kind of confusing because there's two different ways still of understanding this, right? So so um, suppose a certain action is proposed, like walking. That is, it occurs to me, walking occurs to me as a possibility or something like that. And so now the power of the will is going to be to prefer walking or not to prefer walking. So like there's two different, and now the question is, do I exercise that power freely or not? And there's two different ways of understanding that. So one is, it's basically two different ways of understanding what forbear means here, right? Like in one case, forbear means not to prefer anything. Right? So the question is, can I just not use this power? Right? Like the idea of walking has occurred to me as something I might do, and yet I refrain from either preferring it or not preferring it. That is, I refrain from either preferring to walk or preferring not to walk. I suspend my preference. So like, this still probably is not the question we meant when we asked, is the will free? Yeah. Yes.
How does this relate in this connection to like Newtonian physics in any way, in the sense that you must realize that if it's a matter of willing or not willing, you have to be in the state of the good one before making the decision of which one to choose. You know what I mean? If you are walking, you're either someone actively walking with the choice not to walk or to keep walking, or if you're not walking, it's the choice to keep staying still or to stop moving.
So,
I feel like in this way, there seems to be some similarity than his other side, the sciences that he had.
so first of all, it's not only, like Newton is the first one to say it right, exactly right. But the idea that things in motion remain in motion somehow, is like in Galileo and Descartes. It wasn't invented by Newton. And as I think I said before, I'm not sure. It doesn't seem to me that Locke understood Newton very well. Maybe I'm wrong, and it's just me who's not understanding Locke very well. That's definitely possible. Um, but but um, so you're asking about the symmetry? Are you saying like the decision to stop walking, the decision not to walk if I'm walking is the decision to do something, whereas the decision to keep walking if I'm walking is the decision not to do anything?
It's hard. To me, it seems it's hard to have a state that one could be in that then you're, apprehended with the decision to will or to not kind of already be doing one of that.
Yeah, but so, I mean,
Or does it just not matter?
that's, you don't need Newton for that. There's a contradictory opposites, right? So you
Exactly.
have to be doing one of them.
Yeah,
So like, I mean, that is gonna be important in the details. Actually, a lot of the chapter, most of which I didn't assign, is all about, it's like a very long argument about the difference between what pleasure motivates versus what pain motivates. That like pleasure motivates you to remain in the state you're in, whereas pain motivates you to change it. But I don't think that's important at this level yet. I mean, yeah, it's true. Obviously, when I prefer to walk or not to walk, I'm already either walking or not walking. But nevertheless, whichever one I'm doing, I can prefer either that or the other one. And of course, it's not really true of walking. Like walking isn't really a body moving through free space, right? Like, but I don't want to get bogged down in that. Yeah, are you still have a question that?
I was just asking him, I mean, he's empiricist, he's in that experience, so it would seem the one that you're actively doing currently in some way has some preferred, you have a preferred understanding to it, as opposed to the thing that you have yet to do. So
Yeah, well,
I think it is important that whatever you're currently doing does seem to have some kind of preference for sway in a way that kind of the not doing, or the
yeah,
opposite of the doing.
and like I said, Locke does like work that in eventually to his explanation, but here the question is just like, because here, I mean, it's the preferring that we're focusing on here, not the walking, right? The walking is just an example. The question is the preferring. And I mean, I guess in that case, yeah, it just said it's contradictory opposites. You have to be doing one. I mean, that's actually kind of the issue between these two ways of looking at it. Like, you have to be either preferring something or not preferring anything. Those are the contradictory opposites. What's less clear is that you have to either prefer walking or not prefer walking. I mean, certainly before it was proposed, I guess you didn't prefer either one, preferring to walk. So there's something a little weird about that. But in any case, yeah, I don't. Is it okay to go on?
Keep going.
Yeah. All right. So, right. So I was going to say, like, this still isn't really the question we were probably asking. We asked, is the will free, right? Like, am I free not to will anything? Nevertheless, it is kind of an important question, because Descartes and before him, like the Stoics and the skeptics, specifically advise suspension of the will in certain cases. And Locke's answer already to this one is no. I don't have the power to not prefer anything. So he's ruling that out, right? So it's like Cartesian doubt, which is about, right, because Descartes thinks judgment is an act of the will, and it's not even I mean, it's involved in the doubt, but it's also involved in the recommendation going forward. Like if you don't have a clear and distinct perception, you should suspend judgment. And Locke is saying you can't. So, and there's some weird things about his argument for that, but I think, like I said, since this isn't really the question of freedom of the will. I mean, this still isn't what we really meant to ask when we asked if the will is free. I'm not gonna spend a long time on it, but the other one is, well, the other one means like not to prefer, for example, walking. right? So am I free to prefer walking or to prefer not walking? Is now the question. Because we know I'm not free to prefer nothing at all. Right? That is, once the idea is proposed, I have to either prefer it or prefer not it. But the question is that, am I free in that respect? So that is, does it depend on my preference, what I, or, yeah, can I prefer one or the other based on my preference of what to prefer? Um, so I think that is, at least it's the closest Locke comes to discussing the question we really wanted to ask when we asked, is the will free? And Locke's response to it is, well, that's silly. That's an infinite regress, right? This is section book 2, chapter 21, section 25 on page 230. For to ask whether a man be at liberty to will either motion or rest, speaking or silence, which he pleases, is to ask whether a man can will what he wills or be pleased with what he is pleased with, a question which I think needs no answer. And they who can make a question of it must suppose one will to determine the acts of another, and another to determine, sorry, to determinate that, and so on in infinitum. Right? So he's saying that would be an infinite regress. I mean, first I have to prefer walking or not walking. So, but that's supposed to be free. So that means that's gonna depend on whether I prefer walking or prefer not walking. But if that's also free, then I have to prefer walking, or I'm losing count already, right? But so I only got to 3, so the infinite thing is not going to work, right? So now, I mean, um, I think this is a good argument against that I'm always free to prefer or not to prefer. Right? I mean, it doesn't show that I'm never free to prefer or not to prefer, because maybe it only goes one step back, right? So I'm free to prefer to walk or to prefer not to walk, but I'm not free to prefer to walk or to prefer not to walk. It's right. So, but I think, I think Locke is right that when we ask, is the will free? We're, what we're asking, and Locke says that, or implies that our error here is actually moral error, right? That what happens is that we're looking for a way out of responsibility for our actions. And so we want to set some standard that's so high that we'll never meet it. And the standard is that if my preference itself wasn't free, then I'm not responsible. And that would require an infinite regress, apparently, to satisfy it. I mean, apparently, so there's something we'll try to do this with this and whatever, but that is a pretty strong argument. Okay, so then you ask Locke, well, okay, so what does, if it's not my preference, what does determine what I prefer? Right? Like, what determines the will to prefer or not to prefer? So the will is free answer was, the will determines itself to prefer or not to prefer by preferring to prefer or preferring not to prefer. But um, that is, it's self-determining. but at least in Locke's framework, that seems not to make any sense. So we need another answer. What does determine it? And Locke gives his answer, at the end of section 29 on page 232. And to this I answer, the motive for continuing in the same state or action is only the present satisfaction in it. The motive to change is always some uneasiness. Right? So he's saying what does determine the will is pleasure and pain. And then as kind of a footnote, he's saying, and the story behind this is that in the first edition, he said what most people say, which is that the will is like, the motive for action is to get pleasure and avoid pain. Like as if they're completely, those two things are completely parallel to each other. But in between, he started thinking about it and he realized that no, it's really, pleasure is the motive to remain in the state you're in, whereas pain is or uneasiness is a motive to get out of the state into another one. Right. And so he says, like, no matter how pleasant an alternative might seem to you, if you don't feel any uneasiness in your present state, that won't motivate you. And then I think because he changed his mind about it, he goes on for page after page arguing about that. That's the part I didn't assign. But I mean, but I think for the purpose of what I'm going to talk about now, I mean, I'm not sure about this actually. I like if you try to work that detail in throughout, would it change something about ethics or politics or whatever? But Locke himself doesn't seem to have done like a job of trying to work through and see if it changes anything. When he's not in this very section that we're in now, he still talks as if it's, yeah, getting pleasure and avoiding pain is a motive to action. Okay, so in summary, like the Locke's view on the freedom of the will is that the will is not free and it's determined by pleasure and pain. Are there questions about that before I go on? This is what's sometimes called psychological hedonism, to distinguish it from ethical hedonism. I mean, that is, it's not the view that you should do what's most pleasant. It's the view that you will do what's most pleasant. What it seems most pleasant to you, right? I mean, you can be mistaken, but yeah.
Are these ideas about like what is pleasant and not for Locke, are those divine? Do they come from God?
God has determined which, right? Remember back in the chapter when he talked about pleasure and pain, he says, God hath scattered pleasures and pains up and down. So yeah, they come from God, but for good reasons, as he also says there, right? Like, like light hurts your eye and darkness doesn't hurt your eye because light can damage your eye and darkness can't. Right. So, okay. So again, so like in itself, this isn't an ethical theory. Again, it's just a theory about what you actually will do. But it's fundamental to the way Locke ends up understanding what morality is. So, right, so now I'm jumping ahead to the beginning of chapter 28. Book 2, chapter 28. So the title, at least in this edition, the title is Of Other Relations. I just realized this year that in the LibriVox recording I've been listening to, this chapter is called Of Moral Relations. It's true that the only interesting relations in this chapter are the moral relations. But, well, I don't know. Anyway, and Locke begins to discuss those in section 5 on page 316. Good and evil, as hath been shown, are nothing but pleasure or pain, or that which occasions or procures pleasure or pain to us. Right? So the words good and evil don't just mean pleasure or pain, but they're close to just meaning pleasure. So like good means one of two things, either pleasure or useful for procuring pleasure. And evil is like the opposite of things. Right? So pain is evil, and the means of, so to speak, procuring pain, that is, things that if we have them will cause us to have pain, are also evil. So this means, first of all, that like in general, good and evil are thoroughly relative predicates. There's a tacit relation, right? Because whose pleasure? And Locke, and I think he's agreeing with Hobbes about this, probably other people too, but anyway, he's definitely agreeing with Hobbes about this, that when I say something is good, in general, I mean, it's pleasurable to me or it's useful to me. So as in other cases where there's a tacit relation, it can look like we're disagreeing with each other when we're not, right? Like if I say grapes are good, and you say, no, grapes are an evil. That just means, I mean, we could both be right. Because when I say grapes are good, I mean grapes cause me pleasure. And when you say, no, grapes are an evil, you mean grapes cause me pain or uneasiness, right? Like pain is supposed to include, although it seems that Locke thinks that there's literally an idea in common to all these things, pain, right? It just has greater or less intensity or something like that. But it's supposed to include all kinds of discomfort, uneasiness, whatever, right? And similarly in the case of pleasure, yeah.
Yeah, just a quick question. I mean, you know, if Bentham was by Locke directly,
Well, it's, I mean, yeah, I think it's like Bentham got it from so many places. I don't, because, like I said, Locke isn't the first one to say this. Hobbes already says it. And yeah, lots of people say it. I mean, Cicero almost says it, as I'll mention in a moment. Right. So, but okay, so far, this therefore has nothing to do with morality, right? And I mean, that's right. When I say grapes are good, I don't mean grapes are morally good. Or it's morally good to eat grapes or something like that. I just mean grapes are pleasurable, according to Locke, pleasurable or useful. Right? So like if I say money is good, I mean, and I'm not somehow like in a disordered state with respect to irrational state with respect to money, which Locke and many other people would say most of us are. Right? We've gotten confused that we like somehow it's associated with pleasure and now we want money, whether it's useful or not. But if we're thinking about it like rationally, money, There's nothing pleasurable about having money per se, it's that it's useful. Okay, but so to get to morality, we have to add something else. And what Locke says we have to add is law, right? So this is the next sentence. Morally good and evil, then, is only the conformity or disagreement of our voluntary actions to some law, whereby good or evil is drawn on us from the will and power of the lawmaker. So first of all, so moral good is in this category. It's a means of why can't I say that word? Procuring. It's a means of procuring pleasure and avoiding pain. In this specific situation, someone has made a law and they've announced to me that they're going to reward or punish me depending on whether my actions conform to the law or not. And so one way of getting pleasure is to, or avoiding pain, is to conform my action to the law. And it has to be from the will and power of the lawmaker. I think the end of the section here, what he says right after that is, I think, is just kind of an exposition of what it means that it, or why it has to come from the will and power of the lawmaker. Which good and evil, pleasure or pain, attending our observance or breach of the law by the decree of the lawmaker. Oh no, actually, he says this somewhere else. That's where he defines reward and punishment. Oh, it's actually the end of the next section where he emphasizes that like it can't be that the reward is a natural effect of the action. That wouldn't count as moral good. Right? So in other words, if I tell you do X, and if you do X, you'll be rewarded. But what I mean is, like, in the course of nature, doing X will get you pleasure. Then I'm not making a law. I'm just, as Hobbes would say, I'm giving you counsel. I'm giving you advice. For it to be a law, it has to be the good and evil a result of me making it a law. That is, it has to be reward and punishment that comes from the will of the lawmaker. So, I mean, you might think, well, this is kind of a yucky way to think about moral good and evil. Like it's only a way of getting pleasure. That's the only reason you're doing it. But this is where that psychological hedonism is important to keep in mind. That's the only reason you do anything. Right? So if a law didn't involve a sanction, a reward or punishment, then it would be completely ineffective. Like I could tell you, do X even though it's not going to get you pleasure and it's going to cause you pain. But if you believed me, you wouldn't do X because that's not how our will is motivated, right? So, and that's what Locke says in the next section, in section six, still on page 316. For since it would be utterly in vain to suppose a rule set to the free actions of man without annexing to it some enforcement of good and evil to determine his will, we must, wherever we suppose a law, suppose also some reward or punishment annexed to that law. Right? It would be, I could tell you to do something till I'm blue in the face, but unless either it will naturally cause you, unless I can convince you that this is a natural means of getting pleasure and avoiding pain, in which case it's advice. Or I artificially add pleasure and pain, in which case it's a law. Unless I do one of those things, my telling you to do it is just hopeless. Okay, so that's the definition of moral good. So, right, so like, just right down here. Here's pleasure by the will of the lawmaker. A lawmaker and a lawgiver. I think Locke uses both terms here, probably. I'm not mistaken. Or maybe he only uses lawmaker, actually. Yeah, and lawmaker, because lawgiver and lawmaker are not necessarily the same thing. This turns out to be important in Rousseau, right? That like the lawgiver is some wise person who comes up with a law, but they don't have the authority to make it a law. Someone else has to do that. Okay, in any case, so this definition of moral good still makes it relative, and that's why the whole discussion of morality is in this chapter about other relations, because it's relative to the lawmaker. There can be more than one lawmaker. And so to ask whether something is morally good, I can't answer that absolutely. You have to first tell me which law we're talking about. The will of which lawmaker? Um, and in fact, right, so Locke gives three main examples of which law we could have in mind. But like the first two are actually, each one of them is many, many examples, right? Because it's like a kind of law, right? So there's the civil law, and there's the law of opinion or virtue. Right, so obviously the civil law depends which city or state, right? Like, um, polis, like which state are you talking about? Like, what's I could be breaking the law of one state by following the law of another state. And the law of virtue or opinion, which Locke says has to do with like my reputation with those I hang out with, right? Like my tribe or club, the people whose opinion of me matters to me. That's the law of virtue. And this also obviously is going to come in many different forms depending on which society or club or whatever we're talking about. And in fact, when Locke discusses this, his treatment of this is basically cultural relativism of a familiar kind, right? Because like, in one place will be considered brave, and another place will be considered murderous, right? Like challenging someone to a duel or something, right? So it really depends which society you refer it to. And there's no absolute answer. Um, and Locke actually understands all of ancient ethics and pagan ethics, what would now be called virtue ethics, as being about this. And he quotes like Cicero and other people to try to prove that this is what they're really thinking about. I mean, it might work better for Cicero than it would for Aristotle. Plato, I'm not sure if Plato is supposed to be included under virtue ethics at all. Probably shouldn't be. But whether it's regular for Cicero, this is like, so Cicero in the De Officiis, that's on duties, mentions these three different categories. You will say, well, since it's Cicero, I should give a classical pronunciation, dulce, utile, and honestum, right? So this means sweet, literally, but it's talking about this, like what's pleasant. Utile means what's useful. And then there's this other line, which, I mean, this obviously is where the word honest comes from, but Cicero is using it in a much broader sense, right? Like an honest person is like a moral person. He doesn't think that this is the same as either of these. So including Cicero here might be questionable. But in any case, that's all I'm going to say about that. But then the third one really is just one example. It's the divine law. Right? So here the lawmaker is God. And it's only because of this that Locke gets something that looks like absolute ethics out of this. Right? Because why? So like all these things, these three things can disagree with each other in a given situation. But then if you're paying attention, which is a big if, and thinking carefully about your entire future, and you really believe that each of these things, exists, how are you going to decide what to do? Well, the same way you always decide what's going to procure the most pleasure or avoid the most pain. And since God has infinite power and knowledge, God's punishments and rewards are always going to outbid the other ones. Right? Like God is, and like putting in Locke's definition of infinity, or Locke's understanding of the idea of infinity, I think we can see that this still works, right? Like whatever reward or punishment I give you, God can match it and do better. Right? And whatever the chance of being detected is in these cases, God can detect it better because God is omniscient. Right? Or as Locke said way back in book 1, the only true basis of morality is a God who sees men in the dark and is powerful enough to call to account even the most, I forget, something offender. Right. Right. So that is that infinite power and knowledge on God's part is what makes this law take precedence over the others. So, if people don't actually give this preference, then that means either they don't really believe that there's a divine law, there's a divine lawmaker, which Locke is inclined to think, right? Remember, he says, and if you looked more carefully into, forget the Tui Penambo or whatever, right? If you looked more carefully into the people who live right here in England, I think you would find that many of them don't have a very good idea of God and don't believe in God. And you can tell it by the way they act. Right. So, but there could also be other reasons which Locke discusses. Like I said, perhaps it's so like in principle, apparently the psychological hedonism means that I ask what's going to be good for me going as far into the future as necessary. Um, uh, but I think Locke knows that like we have a hard time concentrating on the distant future and preferring it over the present, right? Like I mean, again, that wouldn't be something Locke had to discover, right? Like Epicurus, everyone discusses this. So even if you do believe that God is going to punish you in the end, it might be hard to keep that in mind when these more immediately threatening laws conflict, or when your own immediate desires conflict, right? Someone might say, I don't want to follow any law. I want to do what I know will directly get me pleasure. um, okay. So, but okay, so with that in place, like you might say even though Locke defines morality to include, right? He defines morality in this way that allows me to say what's morally good relative to any law. This is like the true morality, right? This is absolute morality. Like this is the law that if I knew what's best for me, I would follow. um, um, but what is that law and how do we know it? So, I mean, um, he does say here that we could know it either by reason or revelation. Um, the revelation side is weird because law, so you can see from this definition of law why the law has to be promulgated to be effective. Right? Like if I say privately, if I go in my room and say, okay, I'm going to cause everyone pain if they don't do X, but I don't tell them that, then that law is not in effect because it can't provide a motive for them to do it. They have to know about it, right? And revelation is, of course, is weird because it doesn't reach everyone. There's other problems about revelation, which we'll see later. I mean, I think based on what Locke says about the possibility of prophecy later on, it's clear at least that revelation could never conflict with the conclusions of others. The word of the prophet is never as strong as our belief in our own reason. And in any case, when Locke discusses the divine law here in this book, and also usually under the name Law of Nature in the second treatise, he's pretty much always thinking about getting it from reason, not getting it from revelation. I mean, sometimes he'll quote a biblical verse, but if you like pay careful attention, you'll see that there's always an argument also. Right? Like the biblical verse is never supposed to take care of it by itself. It's just supposed to show that the truth is, I think, it's aimed more at this. It's like, and don't think I'm a bad Christian for saying this because it says it in the Bible. Right. So I think for the most part, the answer to this, what is the divine law and how do we know that it's divine law, has to be something that we can figure out on our own. I mean, Locke is going to give a proof of the existence of God, so we can, we can know that there is a God, but the question is, how can we further figure out that God would threaten punishments and offer rewards, and figure out for what things God would threaten punishments and offer. And again, like certainly to the extent that morality is universally binding on everyone, it has to have that character. It has to be promulgated not by revelation, but by reason. So what is it? What is the divine law according to Locke? And it seems like from the discussion here and also from the second treatise, and so this is actually getting closer, although it's still not the same thing as utilitarianism. So it's still not the same thing as Bentham or Mill or whatever, but it seems like the divine law is the law that commands each individual to do what is good for the public. That is, it's the law of public utility. What makes it seem that way here? Well, so first of all, when Locke is trying to prove that God must have given a rule, that God has given a rule whereby men should govern themselves, I think there is nobody so brutish as to deny. He has a right to do it. We are his creatures. He has goodness and wisdom to direct our actions to that which is best. So what he has a right to do it means here is kind of difficult. I mean, perhaps it just means it's what Hobbes would call the right of nature, right? There's no limitations to God's powers, so God has a right to do everything. But the second part is what I want to focus on here. He has goodness and wisdom to direct our actions to that which is best. What do you mean that which is best? So best means goodest, what's good. And here presumably we mean what is morally best? Maybe not, but anyway, well, okay, so I guess put it this way. We seem to have I'm saying this not in the order I plan to. Yeah, let me just leave it there for now, right? That is, best means what? Like, means it will procure, it's useful or procure pleasure for someone. Why? And how is that related to God making the law? So in section 11 here, still in chapter 28, on page 318, no, sorry, on page 320. Locke is explaining why, for the most part, the law of virtue and presumably also the civil law line up with the divine. Why? So he says, there being nothing that so directly and visibly secures and advances the general good of mankind in this world as obedience to the laws he has set them, and nothing that breeds such mischiefs and confusion as the neglect of them. And therefore, men, without renouncing all sense and reason and their own interest, which they are so constantly true to, could not generally mistake in placing their commendation and blame on that side that really deserved it not. Right? That is, he's saying, like, the law of virtue depends on what the people around you praise and blame. Now, how are they going to decide what to praise and blame? Well, sometimes for weird reasons that no one can understand, right? Like for some contingent historical reason. But he says, like, for the most part, they're going to look around and see whether it would be good or bad for them if you do it. This is also going to, we're going to see this, something like this argument also in Hume in the second inquiry. So for the most part, they're going to look and see, like, before they decide whether to praise or blame something, they're going to think to themselves, do I want this person to act this way or not? Will it be good for me or not? Right? And Locke says, since the divine law is the thing that, as everyone can see, will lead to the benefit of society, and disobedience to it will lead to disorder and etc. For the most part, people, like, if they haven't taken leave of their senses, whether they obey these moral principles or not, are gonna, like, praise people who obey them and blame people who don't. Right? In other words, like, even though maybe I'm trying to steal some stuff, to get more pleasure for myself, if you ask me about some third person, praise or blame, and I see that they're stealing stuff, I'm going to be like, no, I'm going to blame that because I don't want them to steal my stuff. Right. So, like, I may make an exception to myself, but the law of virtue just, again, it has to do with, like, people's reputation among their club, right? And, like, the person who everyone knows for a thief, everyone is going to blame and shun because they don't want everyone doing that, right? So that's why Locke says, for the most part, these two things will match up. Well, so, I mean, that example shows, number one, when we say that obedience to this law, to the divine law, manifestly is what's best for society, we're not talking about revelation. Right? We're talking about things that you can figure out for yourself. Like, at least according to Locke, who I think I mentioned in the first lecture, famously gives an explanation for why we have private property and why it's important to have property and so forth. Like, if, everyone can figure out for themselves that society will be in big trouble if we don't respect other people's property. So, they don't have to read that in a book. They just have to look at that principle, see that it's useful for society, and that's why they're gonna praise it. So that's why I say, like, here and most other places, even though he says he does allow for revelation at one point, but here and in most other places, Locke is thinking of the divine law as a law of reason. Right? Because, like, in other words, the divine law was like, don't eat pork. And there's no visible utility of that. Right? And so the reason not to do it, but only because you have this extra, like, supernatural knowledge that God will cause you pain if you eat pork, then there would be no reason for the law of virtue to line up with something like that. You're not going to look around and see that societies where people eat pork are disordered. Yeah.
It's like that work where you go by maxim, right? Like, if I were to do this action, I'm going to commit myself, but I shouldn't do it because if other people did it without that.
It is different, but first of all, I think it's part of the history of it, right? Starting with Locke and then going through Rousseau. I mean, there's a key thing about law that Locke doesn't say here, but he does say in the second treatise, which is that laws have to be universal. Right? So that's his way of distinguishing what Hobbes can't do. Hobbes thinks of a law as a command, right? And so as far as Hobbes is concerned, there's no distinction between sovereignty, between the legislative and the executive faculty of the state, right? So the way Locke and then more strongly Rousseau like tries to make that distinction is to say that the legislative faculty is supreme, but it can't give particular commands, only universal ones. So that's part of the history of what Locke is, what Kant is stating. But yeah, I mean, Locke's view of the relationship between God and morality is close to Kant's. It's much closer to Kant's than, say, Descartes' view is, I think. But it's kind of like backwards.
It feels more like deontological than like other things.
Yeah, but it's not really, because it's all still based on this, right? So it's, that's why I say it's kind of backwards, right? Like what in Locke is the motive and Kant will be the, the necessary end. And, it's like, right. So, and I think that'll be clear when I say one more thing about this, which is, so now we see that the divine law is just what anyone would figure out without knowing about God at all is best for society. And again, it's not clear here, but I think it is clear from other places in this book and from the second treatise that ultimately I should be doing what's best for the society of all rational beings. That's another connection with Kant. But Locke doesn't emphasize that, but again, Locke, unlike Hobbes, doesn't think that there's some suspension of morality when we come to the interaction of sovereign states with each other. Yeah.
Why should we call it divine if it's the right way to figure out so that we know what God is?
Well, so I'm about to get that. So because you might think, so you might call it the absolute law, but then you would furthermore say, and it's not really a law. And Hobbes actually does say this about the laws of nature after he finishes introducing them, that they're really counsel of reason. Hey, but right, because remember, like if I'm just figuring out that this will be to our advantage and that's why we're doing it, then that's a natural effect of the action. It's not a reward or punishment from the will of the lawmaker. But I think what that neglects, and this is where, at least in this place, the connection to Kant is closest. What that neglects is that in general, my individual will won't be aligned with the will of the universal will, the will of the public, or the will of all rational beings. Right? To use Rousseau's distinction, not the will of all, but the universal will. That is what all rational beings would agree on if they knew what was best for them, or something like that, right? And right, like if I didn't know about God, and I just knew what's good for society and what's not, I would certainly have an incentive to praise or blame things that are good for society. Or bad for society. I would certainly have an incentive to try to make laws in my state that would reward what's good for society and what's bad for society. But then when it came to myself, my incentive would be to get out of those laws if possible without suffering the consequences. Right? So like if I'm sure I can steal this and no one will ever know, so I'm not going to get a bad reputation and I'm not going to get punished by the state, then I'm going to do it. Right? Not just like I should do it or something, but again, by psychological hedonism, I will do it. So God is necessary here to align the individual will with the individual interest with the public interest. I think that's what Locke is saying. Okay, are there questions about that? Yes.
Might be a silly question, but why does God have an public interest?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of what I was trying to sweep under the rug when I was, no, like, um, um, why does God want what's best for rational beings in general, or for our species in general, if you don't want to take it that far, although I think Locke would take it that far. Like, I don't think Locke would say a rational parrot doesn't have moral rights because it's not shaped like a person. Not shaped like a human. But I mean, because Leibniz has an answer to that. Kant is going to have an answer to that. But yeah, and from the Locke's proof of the existence of God, if it works, it does show that God is infinitely powerful and infinitely knowledgeable, but it's not clear that it shows that God is infinitely good. It's not clear where that comes from. Where infinitely good would mean something just like this, that God always wills what is best for all rational beings. Yeah, I think that's a good question, but I'm not sure what Locke's answer to it is. Should I? Maybe I shouldn't. I'll just say briefly, the one other issue here is that that in the second treatise, so here it's clear that God is the executive of the divine law, in addition to the legislature, legislator, right? It's like God who's going to reward and punish. In the treatise, it seems more like everyone in general is the executive of the divine law. And when he mentions appealing to heaven in the second treatise, he just means fighting, and whoever's won is presumably the one God wanted to win. Right. So there's some tension there, and I'm not sure how to resolve that. But so there's a lot more things I could say about this, but I haven't talked about personal identity. And it's pretty clear now that I'm not going to get to adequacy or madness. Once again. Did I already say this? Did I already mention this class? I have this AI agent. Did I mention this? Yes. Oh, I did. Okay. Yeah. It's telling me what I already know, basically. It's like, I read its analysis of this lecture, and it says, yeah, this is a classic case where Abe, introduces too much material and then unfolds the first topic until it gets bigger and bigger. And yeah, anyway. So, yeah, I know that. I just don't know how to not do it. So, but I do want to talk about personal identity. So again, remember that so first of all, remember what identity means. I think this can be hard for us to focus on because identity, and especially put together with personal, sounds to us like it might mean something else. But identity just means sameness, right? Like the Latin word means same. And this comes from that. Identitas means sameness. And that's what it usually means in philosophy. At least until very recently. That's what it usually meant in philosophy. So the question of personal identity is, and oh, I see it's still even, oh no, that's since the question for Locke in general about identity is always this is the time axis, and this is the space axis. It's always like, is this at this time the same as this at this other time? About one thing at one time, that there is no such question. Right, so the question of personal identity is this the same, is this at this time the same person as this was at this other time? Just like the question of like oak tree identity would be, is this the same oak tree at this time as this was at this other time? I think I read this before, or at least quoted it, right? In book 2, chapter 27, section 26 on page 312, Locke says, it's pretty late in the discussion of personal identity when he finally says this, but he says about the term person, it is a forensic term. Oh no, actually I didn't mention this before. Someone asked me about it after class. That's what happened. It is a forensic term appropriating actions and their merit. Appropriating, that is attaching them to the correct self, basically. Appropriating actions and their merit, and so belongs only to intelligent agents capable of law and happiness and misery. That is, Locke is saying, the general use of the term person is to talk about someone who's responsible, who can be rewarded or punished, who it makes sense to reward or punish according to a law. Yeah.
What constitutes an intelligent creature?
Well, I mean, I think Locke actually can give a pretty clear answer to that, right? Like, it has to be capable of understanding what a law is and what rewards and punishments are attached to that law, and expecting on that basis to be rewarded or punished for doing something. That's the key, right? It doesn't have to be like some kind of genius or something, but it has to be able to do that much. So like, if we think that minors are not, or anyway not reliably able to do that, like understand how the consequences of their actions will follow from their agreement or disagreement with the law, then a minor would not be a person in this sense. There weren't very many yet in Locke's time, but we have tons of them, these artificial persons who we hold responsible, even though it's not clear who has this foresight and whatever. But that's what we mean, right? Like when you say corporations are people, or persons would be better, right? When you say corporations are persons, like the fundamental meaning of it is something we probably want, namely that corporations are liable for their behavior. Okay, but I don't want to go too much into get lost in it, because I want to say, so first of all, so therefore Locke says the question of personal identity is, what thing in the future I'm deciding how to act now, like whether to steal this thing or not, for example. And you want to stop me from stealing it by saying, if you do, you will be punished. But of course, that doesn't mean I'll be punished right now. I'll be punished in the future. So you're threatening to punish something, some rational being in the future. Which one? That's the question. So Locke says the question of personal identity is really about that. Right, so like, for example, if there's something, so here I am, this human being. If there's something in the future that's related to me in the way the big oak tree is related to the sapling, that is, there's like a continuity of organic process. But I'm not motivated to avoid pain or pleasure for this thing, to avoid pain or seek pleasure for this thing, then although it's the same human, it's not the same person. And vice versa, right? So like if this is the last day, when all will be called to judgment, etc., right? And let's say, you know, this thing here died. It's gone. Right? I mean, the matter that made it up is still there, but that's irrelevant. Because without that organic continuity, it's the same mass of matter, but it's not the same human being. Right? Just like if you burn down the oak tree and reduce it to ashes and scatter them, you can't, there's nothing that's the same oak tree as that sapling was anymore, even though there's the same mass of matter is still there, right? So this thing dies, and then at this time here, a new thing kind of similar, or maybe not that similar. Actually, Thomas Aquinas says that after the resurrection, our bodies will be spherical and transparent. But anyway, something sort of similar to this thing is created. So that's definitely not the same human being as I was. But if I'm motivated to seek pleasure and avoid pain for this thing, then it is the same person as me. All right, I'm out of time, so I'll just say, so the question is, how can we tell which thing this is? And I mean, one question might be, how are we sure there's a unique one? There might be more than one. If that's possible, then this personal identity isn't really a form of identity, and we have a problem. But Locke doesn't consider that. So assume there's only one, which one is it? And Locke says basically, it's the one that remembers or could remember being me. That's the one I want to get pleasure for or avoid pain for in the future. And it's a little bit hard to explain why that would be, but that is Locke's answer, and I don't have time to say more about it. So I will see you on Thursday, when I'll talk about madness.